All right. Living Ocean Society, as you heard, we've been involved as interveners in both the Enbridge and now the Kinder Morgan hearings at the NEB. And so I've learned more about oil chemistry, spill response, and oil tankers than I had ever hoped to know in a lifetime as a result. I'm going to share with you tonight just a little timeline on the English Bay oil spill and a wee snippet of what it means to us as interveners in the Kinder Morgan hearing and how we might learn from it. So if anyone was asleep and didn't actually get a picture of the boat while it was out in the harbor, that's her. A brand new ship built in Korea on its maiden voyage from Japan, flying a Cypriot flag and with Greek owners, and none of that is unusual in the shipping business. There she is at anchorage 12 in English Bay, and you can see the boom deployed around the ship. That's one kind of boom. Dr. Peter Ross from the aquarium was out right away to get some samples from the thing. This is a picture of the kind of goo that was washing up on the beach, just so you have an idea what we were actually talking about when we talked oil. And I had my mapping team put together a little map so we could just orient ourselves to the way this all unfolded. Let me see if I can get a cursor going here for you. The ship is actually at anchor here. The first responder, not the first responder, but rather the first person to report the spill was a sailor by the name of Rob O'Day, and he was situated about here when he reported it. As you can see from the wind direction indicator, it's no big surprise why he reported it when he got to where he was. The wind was blowing at about 9 knots straight across the spill and toward his boat. The black dots indicate the beaches that were oiled over the subsequent days. You can see it went as far into, very sensitive little cursor here, went as far as Sandy Cove on West Van and all the way up to New Brighton. Maybe I just won't use the cursor anymore. You guys can see the dots. Western Canada Marine Response Corporation was situated that far from the spill. That's where the Kitsilano Coast Guard would have been if they hadn't closed the base. And that cross-hatched area is the fisheries closure we are now dealing with because nobody could get there in time to corral the spill. We can come back to that map later if anyone wants to have a closer look at it, but now I am actually going to deliberately change the slide and start to take you through a quick timeline of what went on here. Now, I reached out to Rob O'Day, that sailor who first reported the spill, because I'd heard something he said on the first media report that was extremely important about what his observations were of the oil. So a lot of the timeline in these early slides here is directly from Rob. It's a quotation from him. The one thing we don't know is exactly when the ship began to leak oil yet. I'm sure that will be discovered, but it must have arrived at anchorage there sometime on the 8th of April, and certainly sometime before 4:10 when Rob O'Day left False Creek. Maybe I can just go back to that map for half a second to show you his trip. He came out from False Creek down here, sailed right up past the second and third beaches, and first noticed the oil spill when he was at Third Beach. So I think it's pretty safe to say that Rob was on the scene just about the same time the spill happened. He, in other words, had the spill been there when he left False Creek, he probably would have smelt it. He was that close to it. In any event, by 4:45, he had noticed a strong smell like asphalt. He saw a slick on the water, but because he couldn't tell what it was from the distance he was at, he turned toward it. By 5 o'clock, he was sure that he was dealing with an oil spill, and he could make out that it was at least half a kilometer long and 250 meters wide. He described it, and this was the point that really caught my attention in the media. He said the surface was covered with a blue sheen, but beneath the surface, there were globs of oil, and they numbered in the thousands per square meter of water. They were within the top few inches of the water yet, but there were different sizes, some the size of a pea, some as big as the size of a fist. I'll explain why that's important later. What Rob did was immediately to try to contact the authorities, and that was a bit of a problem. The website for the Vancouver Police department said to phone 911. 911 put him through to the Vancouver Police Department, who then tried to connect him with Coast Guard, but they couldn't get through. So he left a cell number. It didn't take long, though. Coast Guard called him back within 3 minutes from a 250 area code, because of course there aren't any down here anymore. Rob explained to them the size of the spill he was looking at, and the Coast Guard said somebody else had already reported it. This isn't uncommon. People report spills in the harbor all the time. He told Rob that they already had a crew en route to the site, and that he was specific. It was a cleanup crew was en route to the site. Rob stayed on the scene and was able to say that at 6 o'clock, a Port Authority boat arrived, and he watched that boat for the next 2 hours as it motored back and forth through the spill, not intervening in any way, but watching as the spill continued to grow. At 7:30, it was getting dark. Rob headed back in. There were still no response vessels in the area. But interestingly, as he was leaving the scene, he said, when we passed by the stern of the offending freighter, it was clear to him where the oil was coming from at that point. He said he found large, sticky gobs of black goo, a meter long and as thick as your arm. Oil everywhere, both on the surface and again below the surface. He made the observation twice. I thought it was interesting that the crew of the ship were apparently trying to load 50-gallon drums of something or another onto the boat at the time and dropping pails over the side to pick up water from around the boat. I don't know if they were trying to determine whether or not they were spilling or what was going on, but Rob certainly felt it was a Keystone Cops kind of scene, and still no intervention from the authorities. Now, it has to be the case that the Port Authority boat saw the same things Rob saw the activity on the ship, and must surely have observed the oil submerged beneath the surface of the water. It wasn't until just past 8 that Coast Guard notified the Response Corporation, Western Canada Marine Response, and actually requested a spill response here. At the time, the next day rather, Roger Girard, the Coast Guard Assistant Commissioner actually, reported that it took them till 8:30 at night to realize that it actually was a significant spill event and to contact both the port and the police. Western Canada Marine Response, it must be said, responded within the sort of time frame that's expected of them. They were on the scene, at least, within an hour and a half. There are varying reports, and I honestly do not know the truth of when the real response started, in the sense that they had skimmers and booms out there. One of the things that was interesting about researching this and trying to find the truth about that is you would think that by now, this many days past the spill, there would actually be a reliable timeline and somebody would be telling you what they really did. But no. The way that everyone, and I mean everyone, has chosen to report this, every government authority and the Response Corporation, is 80% of the oil was recovered within 36 hours and 90% of the oil was recovered within how many hours afterward, and there's just no information about what really happened. So it's clear that that night there was trouble determining where the spill was coming from, according to Western Canada Marine Response. By 10:20 at night, though, the Coast Guard must have realized that something was amiss with the ship because they were actually on board. Somewhere between midnight and 5 in the morning, a boom went around the ship. And again, Coast Guard was out there giving us facts and figures first thing the next morning. You know, that boom was on there at 9 o'clock at night. Well, no, actually it was 11. It might have been, they might not have done it till midnight, or nope, they worked all night with the skimmers and the booms. And then finally, on the WCMRC website today, I found an admission that they hadn't actually boomed the ship until 5:03 in the morning. Whatever. At 5:06, they remembered that they hadn't told the city of Vancouver about the spill. So they got a call through there. There's some question as to whose responsibility that was. There should not be any question as to whose responsibility that was. By 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, the Coast Guard was out with its speaking notes, and they were quite specific. The spill was 2,800 litres. Actually, at one point, they were reporting 2,790 litres, and I was just rolling my eyes thinking, Right, 0.7, wasn't it? They were saying that by that time they'd already recovered 1,400 of them, that they didn't know exactly what the substance was they were trying to clean up, but they'd sent it for testing. The master of the ship wasn't being very helpful at that point. He was denying that the ship was the source of the spill, so this did cause some difficulty, both with determining who was the appropriate response agency, i.e. who's going to pay for this, and with determining the nature of the substance. But by that afternoon, there were already tar balls being washed up on the beaches. The health authority had closed English Bay, Kitsilano's second and third beaches by that afternoon. It had to be clear at that point that they were dealing with a heavy oil indeed. Right. I'm going to explain to you, just jumping ahead, why it was that I was so interested in what Rob O'Day had to say about the oil. One of the main issues that we've been dealing with first Enbridge and now Kinder Morgan, is an insistence that it's okay to ship diluted bitumen because we can clean it up. And a great deal of hearing time and a great deal of scientific time has been devoted to trying to figure out what is going to happen to bitumen when it's spilt into the marine environment. It never has actually happened, and so we don't really have any information about it. The interesting thing about diluted bitumen is it's not dissimilar to bunker C fuel oil, which is what we think spilled in English Bay. If this ever agrees to come back on again, I'll show you a lovely little slide that explains how that is. But basically what's happening is when crude oil is distilled, all of the lighter elements, the gasoline, the jet fuel, the naphtha, if I had the slide in front of you, I could rhyme these off perfectly. But all the lighter hydrocarbons are taken off, and what's left, the dregs at the bottom of the distillation tank, are bunker C fuel. It's a very, very heavy oil, thick, viscous. Interestingly, bitumen is virtually the same stuff. It's formed naturally, though. Rather than being distilled to that state, microbes have been eating away at it over the years. So bitumen is the gunk that even the microbes didn't want to eat. And bunker C is the crud that's left behind after the distillation of crude oil. Bitumen's actually even a little heavier than bunker C, depending on the blend and where it comes from. These things are all quite variable. But one thing we didn't know for sure was what would happen to the dilbit when it hit the water. Well, knowing now that when, let me just try and get this back up quick. Knowing now that when the bunker C hit the water, it must have been submerged within perhaps an hour, certainly within a number of hours of hitting the water. We have a much clearer picture of what might happen in the event of a spill in English Bay. Anyway, I'm very hopeful that our expert will be able to assimilate some of the evidence from the spill and provide a more fulsome opinion for the NEB for the Kinder Morgan hearings. Interestingly, also, at 3 p.m. on the day following the spill, yes, the retired or fired Coast Guard members from the Kitsilano station started to make news as well. Had they still been there, they said they could have responded to the spill within 6 minutes. Coast Guard, of course, immediately came out and said, we never would have asked you to. It's totally irrelevant. They had oil spill response training. They had an oil spill response boat. Why wouldn't you have asked them to respond? There's probably a reason for that, but I don't know it. Then Friday, I kind of nicknamed this Blame Day. It's not that it was confined to a single day. It did actually go on for 4 or 5, and in fact, it still hasn't stopped. But it was interesting. Mayor Robertson blaming everybody, and rightly so. I mean, what did the city do wrong there? Premier Clark was blaming the Coast Guard for the response time and also getting in her licks on the Kitsilano Coast Guard station. Transport Canada was blaming the ship owner and assuring us that the ship owner would pay the cleanup costs, denying that the Kitsilano base would have been of any use. And there was Industry Minister James Moore blaming everyone for blaming everyone else. And I love this the best, for spreading misinformation. By Friday afternoon, Vancouver Parks Board was closing parts of the seawall near Siwash Rock where they were cleaning it. At Sandy Cove in West Vancouver, we'd had a slick come ashore that was some 80 meters long and a meter wide. That was after they'd said there were only 6 liters of oil out there. I'll just put that in context. Ambleside Beach was oiled for the first of what proved to be many times. It reopened yesterday for the first time, and the health advisory that accompanies the reopening says there's still oil on the beach, don't play with it. John Lawson Park Beach is still closed and still oiled, obviously. So by the Saturday after the spill, we had the industry minister reporting 80% cleaned up within the first 6 hours, 36 hours, sorry, and 95% cleaned up as at that date. This was the commissioner's claim there were only 6 liters left. But he offered a public health warning, bunker fuel is not healthy stuff. I like that. The attention of the Coast Guard turned on the Saturday primarily to beach cleanup, and that, so far as I know, has finished now, except at the John Lawson Beach. On Sunday, the Coast Guard was beginning to backpedal a bit because obviously the stories about the spill volume had been a little premature. My favorite quote was the top one there: "Physics tells us it has to float, and we did the work on the water in sufficient time to get it when it should still be afloat, notwithstanding the fact that we'd all seen it not afloat." That quote comes directly from one of Enbridge's experts. I happened to be present at the hearings when he uttered it. It was not true then, and it is not true today. Girard also said that divers will eventually take a look at the seafloor in the slim likelihood that some of the fuel sank beneath the surface. What was never explained in all of this was how he was busy talking about getting a thin sheen off the surface of the water, and yet people were picking up tar balls. Now, where did the tar balls come from if all that was out there was a thin sheen on the surface of the water? They're two entirely different things. That viscous muck that you saw in the picture of Peter Ross's hand cannot form a thin sheen on the surface of the water. It's the consistency of bubble gum. So it just boggles the mind that they continue not to talk about this. Anyway, as of Sunday, the west side beaches were, and I quote this because I really don't believe it, assessed as clean, meaning we're not going to do any more work on them. By Monday, the staff of the Kitsilano Coast Guard base was fighting back in spades, calling out the Coast Guard for what they called outright lies about the equipment and training of the personnel stationed there and what they might have achieved for us in terms of spill response. And the Coast Guard was really backpedaling about the spill volume by this time and explaining very carefully that they calculated the spill volume by measuring, the surface area that it covered and multiplying by the thickness of your average unconfined spill, which is all very scientific, unless, of course, you know that most of the oil that spilled is under the surface of the water and can't be seen in that manner. By Tuesday, we had the fisheries closure starting, and I showed you on the map the rather large area that's now closed to crab, shellfish, and groundfish. Interestingly, DFO chose not to close it to smelt fishing, which is unfortunate. It's not that the smelt are dangerous to human health, but most of their larvae were probably killed on the beaches that were oiled, and so there is likely to be a population gap, at least, if not collapse. It would be nice to have lots of adults around to make up that gap in the future. But as I say, it's early days, and the studies are just being done on the surf smelt to find out what had happened. In terms of the official reports I've been able to find, there was direct, in terms of wildlife impacts, there was direct impact on about 30 seabirds, 3 of which were severely oiled, but they have been recovered and released. There was 1 seal reported, but nobody was able to confirm that it was oiled. And then we have Ramona de Graaf working with the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation to look into the question of the death of surf smelt. That's my neat little diagram of oil distillation. And you can see the fuel for ships, the bunker fuel oil, is down here. Bitumen in the form of asphalt for roads and whatnot is the final residue, the heaviest bit of the oil altogether. So What's going to be good about the information that comes out of this is it's going to help us answer that big question, how long will spilled dilbit float? The industry studies we've been working with insist that it'll be floating on the water for 6 to 10 days or more, and that we'll be able to corral it all and scoop it up. But our experience of the last few days suggests not. The bunker sea was clearly submerging in English Bay within a matter of hours. There are 4 really important factors to look at when you're trying to answer the question, how long is oil going to continue to float? 1, salinity, 2, wind speed, temperature, and the thickness of the oil. These all have an effect, the last 3 have an effect on how quickly the oil will evaporate and become more thick, more dense, and sink. And salinity, of course, is the buoyancy factor for the water. So in English Bay spill conditions, what did we have? The surface water was close to fresh because of the spring runoff and the rains. But in terms of the other factors, winds calm, moderate spring temperatures, neither of those factors should have hastened the weathering of the oil or the sinking of the oil. And the slick thickness was no different from what any other oil slick would be. So, long story short, it's a pretty good proxy for spilled dilbit and probably tells us what's going to happen when dilbit spills here. Thank you. Those are my remarks. I'm going to turn over to Ricky Ott now. And